Hey everyone, I'm Bebster01, and in this video, I will be ranking every main DPS character in Honkai Star Rail as a version 2.6, including Rappa. Some quick rules before I get into the ranking are that I will consider all 5 stars at E0 and 4 stars at E6, but I will also note when a particular Eidolon for a 5 star is especially game-changing. I will also only be ranking traditional main DPS characters, meaning that sub-DPS characters like Topaz and Moza won't be featured in this tier list. This list is meant to be a general ranking across all endgame content, which includes Memory of Chaos, Pure Fiction, and Apocalyptic Shadow. Therefore, some characters who excel in a game mode and flop in another can still be ranked highly. Also, I don't own or have every character in the list built, so some of the background clips are from other players. I listed all their channels down in the description below, and you should definitely go check them out. Lastly, a quick disclaimer. This ranking is heavily based on current meta, but is still subjective, so if you disagree with any of my placements, you're wrong. I'm just kidding, let me know if I missed anything or if you believe any of my rankings are off in the comments. Remember, every character can be strong when built correctly, and you should always play whatever characters you want to play, since Star Rail isn't exactly the hardest game ever made. This video took a ton of time to make, so if you enjoyed this video, a like and subscribe would be greatly appreciated. Also, thank you so much for helping me hit 1,000 subscribers. It may not be a lot for modern YouTube standards, but it still means a ton to me. With everything said, let's jump right into the tier list. Starting us off at the bottom of the C tier, we have base form Dong Heng. He's one of the free characters we get during the tutorial, and I think I speak on behalf of everyone that he is instantly benched the second we pull someone better. To his credit, he is a free character and he is pretty decent in the early game. His ability multipliers are above average for a 4 star, and he has high base speed and built-in damage amp and res pen in his kit. Unfortunately, his damage is just not there, especially since he is strictly single target only. He has a very bland kit, does very mediocre damage, and can't even proc his own talent without help from allies. These reasons make Dong Heng the worst DPS character in the game. Joining Dong Heng in the C tier is Physical Trailblazer. Nobody uses this character, and if you say that you do, you're lying. Especially since Harmony Trailblazer exists and provides so much more value to your account compared to their physical counterpart, there is no reason that you should be using this character. They do beat Dong Heng out slightly because they can deal blast damage rather than be limited to single target only, plus their physical element makes building Break on them more viable. But why would you bother building Break when you can't even run them with Harmony Trailblazer? Next up in the C tier is Arlan, who has sadly been dubbed as the worst DPS character in the game despite Dong Heng and Physical Trailblazer being arguably worse. Arlan probably got this title because unlike the previous 2 characters, he isn't a free tutorial character. Arlan's kit just doesn't make sense. His kit revolves around consuming health instead of skill points to deal damage, making him very SP positive. However, he has the lowest base defense in the game and has no self-healing ability like Blade, making him super squishy. He relies heavily on his teammates, making his team comps extremely limited. He also just doesn't do much damage. He does deal AoE damage, but that doesn't save him from his placement on this list. Hook is the next character in the C tier, and she suffers from a lot of the same problems as the aforementioned characters. Her damage is very mediocre, and she is mainly single target with the occasional blast attack despite her misleading destruction path. Her Eidolons give her a nice upgrade, and she deals decent single target toughness damage. She also doesn't have any innate problems in her kit like Arlan. Unfortunately, she's just a very average DPS character, and there are so many alternatives that outshine her completely. Misha is the next character in the C tier, which is surprising considering he is one of the newer characters released into the game in version 2.0. This is sadly the fate of many of the 4-star DPS characters in the game, since they just can't keep up with the damage output of 5 stars. Hoyo should learn from the success of 4-star support characters like Gallagher, Hunt March 7th, and Moza, and just stick to releasing 4-star support characters since they naturally possess more longevity and meta relevance compared to 4-star DPS characters, which are usually dead on arrival since 4-star DPSs as a concept is just flawed. But that is a topic for another video. Misha deals decent AoE damage and his ultimate is actually quite powerful at full stacks. Unfortunately, quite powerful for a 4-star DPS standard is just not that powerful in general, and there are many stronger DPS options in the game. Serval is the last character and the best character in the C tier. She deals consistent AoE damage with her skill and ultimate, and her single target toughness damage is surprisingly high despite being an erudition character. She has high ultimate uptime due to its low energy cost, and she can keep enemies shocked indefinitely. She is easily the strongest out of all the characters mentioned so far, but she suffers the same fate of being a 4-star DPS. Her low placement ultimately comes down to her mediocre damage relative to other DPS options. Moving on from the C tier to the bottom of the B tier, we have Sushang. Sushang edges out all of the characters we have covered so far since she can actually deal some pretty good damage. She does suffer from being a strictly single target DPS like Heng, but she deals more damage and doesn't rely as much on her teammates. She really shines when built as a crit and break hybrid DPS as she excels against weakness broken enemies. However, the next character on this list does pretty much exactly what Sushang does, but better. Luka finds himself in the B tier. He is basically just Sushang 2.0 as he is easier to build and has access to the incredibly powerful 4-star resolution light cone. He deals great single target damage, has built-in bleed and damage amp in his kit, and doesn't require any crit when being built as a break DPS. Luka is also viable in dot teams since he can trigger his own bleeds, but that makes him more of a sub DPS character, so we will only focus on his potential in break teams as the main DPS. The resolution light cone is fairly accessible as it's a 4-star, and it is one of the strongest nihility light cones in the game, rivaling even the likes of 5-star light cones. The reason this light cone is so strong is that it gives your team free defense shred against any target attacked by the wielder. Luka is a very competent 4-star DPS, but his damage still pales in comparison to stronger break DPS characters. Speaking of stronger break DPSs, Xueyi is next up in the B tier. Although she isn't a pure break DPS, her damage does scale with break effect for huge permanent damage percent bonuses. She easily destroys quantum weak enemies, and even if the enemy isn't quantum weak, her ultimate and E4 allows her to deal type ignoring toughness damage. She can even inflict quantum break on any enemy regardless of their weakness. She has an incredibly unique and powerful kit for a 4-star DPS character, but she isn't as flexible as other DPSs. She relies heavily on her team to also contribute toughness damage, and her damage does fall off against certain enemy lineups. She also requires high investment to reach her peak, which may not be worth it for players who can invest the same amount of resources into a stronger character. Next up in the B tier is Qingque, another 4-star quantum DPS. Qingque is one of the oldest 4-star DPS characters in the game, being released way back at launch. However, she has also remained one of the most formidable 4-star DPS characters after all this time. Her value wasn't immediately realized back then since she is a late game damage dealer. Similar to Xueyi, she also requires a ton of investment to become viable, which may not be worth your resources. She is also extremely reliant on RNG since she's literally a chronic gambler in the lore. She can easily steal all of your skill points if you're unlucky, which can ruin some otherwise good runs. However, if built properly and RNG is in your favor, she deals some of the highest damage out of all of the 4-star characters in the game. She deals potent AoE damage and excels in hypercarry setups like Mono Quantum or Double Harmony. It is for these reasons that she is one of the highest rated 4-star characters on this list. Nearing the top of the B tier is Qingque, Lieutenant of the Cloud Knights. Qingque is our first 5-star character to appear on the list, Trailblazer doesn't count, and is tied with Arlan for being the most universally ridiculed DPS character. This is really unfortunate as Qingque is one of my favorite characters in the game, both lore-wise and gameplay-wise. Many people know by now that his kit is very awkward to build around, which is explained in depth by Red Flame's Qingque video. This is mainly due to the sheer amount of free crit stats his kit gives him, which is both a blessing and a curse. His free stats make farming relics a lot more forgiving, but building around them almost always results in wasted stats. His team comps are also incredibly limited, requiring a strong shielder like Aventurine or Gepard to make use of his Soul Seal Sync passive. His awkward kit, combined with the fact that he's also strictly single target, sadly makes him the worst 5-star DPS in the game. However, I believe that he is also heavily underrated considering just how awful some people believe him to be. I've seen people call him not only the worst DPS, but the worst character in the entire game, which is completely untrue. His single target damage is still outstanding, and with the new 2.6 hypercarry relic sets, he will only continue to grow stronger. Finishing off the B tier is Herta, who also happens to be the last 4-star character on the list. Herta is a special case as she is very weak in all game modes besides Pure Fiction, in which she completely and utterly dominates. I can't rank her any higher due to her limited use cases, but when she does work, her performance rivals even that of limited 5-star characters. She excels in AoE content like Pure Fiction, and even if there are only 2 or 3 enemies, she can still leave an impact. She deals large amounts of toughness damage and is also extremely viable in dual carry setups thanks to her follow-up attacks. She also gets her Eidolons for free from clearing Simulated Universe, making reaching her max potential even easier. It is for these reasons that Herta is the highest rated 4-star DPS in the game. Starting off the A tier is none other than Qingque, member of the Stellaron Hunters and mother of the Trailblazer. At this tier and onwards, all of these DPSs are more than powerful enough to carry you through endgame content, so if your favorite character is ranked lower than you expected, they are by no means weak. Qingque deals consistent AoE damage through her abilities and dots, and her unique ability to detonate dots makes her difficult to power creep. She is also fairly easy to build as she doesn't care about crit stats at all. However, her lack of crit and a relatively simple kit is a double-edged sword, raising her damage floor but also lowering her damage ceiling. This lowered damage ceiling is especially noticeable when compared to newer DPS characters who can easily outdamage her. The main reason why Qingque is ranked at the bottom of the A tier is simply due to the dot archetype currently being extremely neglected by Hoyo. The most recent meta dot character released was Black Swan way back in version 2.0, and the dot roster has been collecting dust ever since. Joining his fellow Stellaron Hunter in the A tier is Blade. He is personally my favorite Stellaron Hunter, and I still find his playstyle super satisfying to this day. Unfortunately, this ranking isn't based on how much fun he is to play, but how strong he is meta-wise. Blade has excellent self-sustain and skill point efficiency for a DPS character, making him super comfortable to play. He can also slot into a variety of different teams, either as a hyper carry or as a sub DPS. However, Blade suffers from the same problem as Qingque, which is that his archetype, or lack thereof, has no specialized teammates to really take advantage of his unique HP scaling mechanic. What edges Blade over Qingque is his team flexibility as well as his ability to capitalize on the upcoming hypercarry meta with Sunday and the new support relic sets, which has no impact really on dot teams. Additionally, the new 2.6 event Lycone seems tailor-made for Blade, indicating that Hoyo hasn't forgotten about him completely. Next up in the A tier is our favorite Knight of Beauty, Argenti. Argenti rose in the rankings after version 2.6, as he is one of the main winners of the new DPS relic set. Similar to Herta, he is extremely potent in pure fiction, but falls behind slightly in other endgame content. He has some of the best AoE damage in the game, and his single target damage isn't that bad either. He is also incredibly free-to-play friendly, as he doesn't need any Eidolons, and his current best support happens to be Tingyun, a 4-star released at launch. The main reason he ranked higher than the last two limited 5-star DPSs is because he finally received his best in slot relic set, the Scholar set, in version 2.6. This set grants free crit rate and significant buffs to skill and ultimate damage, which just so happens to be Argenti's main sources of damage. Additionally, with Sunday around the corner and rumors of a new energy support like Tingyun, Argenti is seeing a lot of newfound potential. Next up in the A tier is none other than our General Jingren. Although he was admittedly underwhelming on release and maybe even still so now, he has only seen consistent improvement since launch through numerous indirect buffs, including the Duke set, Robin, follow-up attack meta, new 2.5 planar ornament set, Sunday, and the inevitable Summoner meta. Being an erudition unit, he has fantastic AoE damage and decent single target damage through his Lightning Lord. He is also surprisingly good at breaking lightning weak enemies due to each Lightning Lord attack being treated as a separate damage instance. Unfortunately, despite all his strengths and indirect buffs, his current damage as of 2.6 just can't keep up with more DPS characters and archetypes. His damage profile is heavily reliant on his Lightning Lord, meaning the majority of his damage is backloaded and also makes being crowd controlled even more devastating. Himiko, the esteemed navigator of the Astral Express, is our next character in the A tier. Himiko is the perfect example of a character who aged like fine wine. She was initially regarded as one of the weakest 5-star units in the game on launch, especially since she was a standard 5-star DPS, and those aren't exactly known for their longevity in Hoyo's other game, Genshin. Her lackluster single target damage made Mach particularly challenging for her, as it was the only endgame content available at the time. However, with the release of new endgame content like Pure Fiction and Apocalyptic Shadow, as well as the rise of game-defining archetypes like Follow-Up Attack and Break, Himiko's true potential was quickly realized. Although Himiko's AoE follow-up and break-focused kit struggles in Mach, it is greatly appreciated in Pure Fiction and Apocalyptic Shadow, which favors consistent AoE damage output and weakness breaks. She beats out many limited 5-star carries in these game modes, which makes her status as a standard 5-star from launch even more impressive. Unfortunately, she isn't the best carry in either follow-up attack or break teams, making her almost a jack of all trades but a master of none. Next up in the A tier is Jade, a senior manager and loan shark from the IPC Strategic Investment Department. Jade is actually the only character in the IPC to be featured in this ranking, as her colleagues Topaz and Aventurine aren't typically played as main DPSs. To clarify, Jade is played in dual carry setups, while Topaz is purely a sub DPS. I actually really like her kit and playstyle, as her animations are incredibly fluid and satisfying to watch. Just like Himiko, Jade excels in pure fiction and all AoE content. She synergizes incredibly well with existing AoE and AoE follow-up characters and is one of the few teammates who actually work perfectly with Blade. She also capitalizes on the powerful follow-up attack meta, benefiting from meta supports like Robin and Aventurine. Her E1 is also one of the most versatile Eidolons in the game, significantly amping her follow-up attack damage and making her viable outside of AoE teams. However, without her E1, she really falls flat outside of AoE content. At E0, her single target damage is mediocre, and her team flexibility is limited, as she needs to be played alongside other AoE DPSs to reach her full potential. Another standard 5-star unit finds herself towards the top of the A tier, and she's none other than Clara. Clara is the last standard 5-star to be featured in the ranking, and she does not disappoint. The reason she was able to last so long in the meta is because of her unique and incredibly powerful counter mechanic, which is only featured on her and one other character who will appear later in the list. Counter is a sub-archetype of the powerful follow-up attack archetype, meaning she directly benefits from meta supports like Robin and Topaz. Her counter mechanic grants her an extremely high damage ceiling, especially for a standard 5-star unit released back in 1.0. She is also exceptionally flexible, being viable in both single target and AoE content through her high single target damage and AoE skill and enhanced counters. However, her biggest asset is also what kind of holds her back. Her damage being reliant on counters makes RNG play a bigger role for her than for other DPSs. She struggles against slow and non-aggressive enemies like Warp Trotters, since they will proc her counters less frequently. She also needs to be directly attacked in order to trigger her counters, but this is easy to achieve through aggro manipulation with team setups and aggro boosting light cones. Closing out the A tier is none other than our very first limited 5-star unit in the game, Seal. Seal has aged surprisingly well for a 1.0 DPS, as you can still run her comfortably in endgame content like Mach and Pure Fiction. She does struggle more in Apocalyptic Shadow when there isn't quantum weakness, but this can mostly be remedied by running Silverwolf in her signature mono quantum team. The reason why Seal is viable in AoE content like Pure Fiction despite being a hunt character lies in her incredibly unique resurgence mechanic, which isn't seen on any other character. After defeating an enemy, she triggers Resurgence, which allows her to immediately receive an extra turn with significantly boosted damage. This mechanic allows her to chain her attacks on multiple targets, making her a rare universal DPS. As expected of a hunt character, she dominates single target content, and she also benefits from the incredibly powerful quantum set which grants up to 20% defense ignore. Unfortunately, her age is beginning to show, especially when compared with newer and shinier DPS characters. In order to compete with the most meta DPS characters, Seal requires an insane amount of investment and degree of knowledge about the game, but she needs speed tuning to reach her full potential. Her best supports like Sparkle, Silverwolf, and maybe Sunday are all limited 5 stars, and she needs heavy vertical investment in order to stand out. However, given how long she's been released for, it's still extremely impressive how she can still keep up with the current meta. We are now at the S tier, where all of the characters are easily meta viable and can comfortably carry you across endgame content. Dong Heng makes a comeback in this tier list, but this time in his dragon form in Bitter Lune. The reason why Do is still so strong in the meta, despite being released way back in version 1.3, is simple. He deals a crazy amount of damage. Although newer DPSs have been released who can outdamage him, his own damage is still overkill. Although he does require heavy investment to truly shine, has a very selfish playstyle, and almost requires Sparkle due to being extremely skill point negative, those downsides can be overlooked simply due to the sheer amount of single target and AoE damage he can output. Do is also our earliest case of Eidolon power creep, with his E2 making him almost a completely different character than at E0. E0 is already plenty strong enough to clear endgame content, but his E2 enables him to keep up with even the strongest DPS characters ever released. Following up Do in the S tier is his fellow High Cloud Quintet member and former Sword Champion of the Luofu, Jingliu. I was debating who I should rank higher between Do and Jingliu, but since she finally received some love from Hoyo with the new 2.6 relics, she edges him out for this spot on the list. Qingque has always been a consistently strong DPS, but has slowly been fading from the spotlight due to receiving almost no attention from Hoyo up until recently with the release of the new Scholar set. She has all the hallmarks of a powerful DPS: great damage output, low skill point usage, frequent actions due to the built-in 100% action advance in her kit, and tons of free stats like Yanqing. Except her free stats have high uptime and are easily accessible instead of being locked behind an awkward passive. She does have some issues, including a lack of a specialized support and her being outdamaged by newer DPSs just like Dill. Her built-in action advance seems great on paper and for the most part is, but it can also cause some problems with buff uptime. However, this new Scholar set and upcoming release of Sunday places her in a really good spot right now. Next up in the S tier is Boothill, a cyborg cowboy galaxy ranger holding a violent grudge against the IPC. He deals an absolutely ludicrous amount of single target damage, easily decimating bosses and single target content like Mach and Apocalyptic Shadow. Being a break DPS, his ability to implant physical weaknesses on enemies is extremely valuable. This also makes him easier to build as he only cares about speed and break effect. He has no attack scaling like other break DPSs, allowing him to run any main stat on his body piece and planar orb. He also deals a ton of toughness damage and is more skill point efficient than most DPSs. All these factors combined with the fact that Hoyo loves the break archetype and can't stop making broken supports for them, makes Boothill one of the strongest and most underrated DPS units in the game. What does hold him back from being even better is that he is strictly single target, meaning that he is extremely underwhelming in pure fiction. He also needs his signature light cone or the new Moza Gacha 4-star light cone at high refinement in order to unlock his full potential, making him less free-to-play friendly compared to other characters. Dr. Ratio is next up in the S tier, and he is the perfect example of a free 5-star unit done right. Despite being released way back in version 1.6 and was given for free to all players at the time, he is still one of the strongest DPS characters in the entire game, even at E0 and without a signature light cone. He is a top tier single target damage dealer with a unique ramp up mechanic that allows him to accumulate permanent crit buffs in combat. Being a follow-up attack DPS, he can take advantage of meta supports like Robin and Topaz, and his follow-up attacks deal absurd amounts of toughness damage and gives great energy economy. He is also one of the most free-to-play friendly characters ever, being free for everyone and having many powerful free-to-play light cone options to choose from. Unfortunately, he does have some weaknesses. He takes time to ramp up to his max potential, and he also struggles in AoE content due to being a mostly single-target DPS. He was also recently overshadowed by a new single-target follow-up attack DPS, which we will discuss later in this list. Next up in the S tier is Yunli, one of the least owned and most underrated characters in the entire game. She is one of the most satisfying characters to play in my opinion, especially when you perfectly time her enhanced counters to launch that juicy 200k nuke. Many people are starting to see the value of Yunli, so I guess it sucks being a Yunli skipper nowadays. She is one of the most universal DPS characters in the game, being effective across all 3 modes of endgame content currently in the game. She deals outstanding single target and AoE damage, has built-in sustain and crowd control resistance, and benefits from the follow-up attack meta as she is a counter DPS just like Clara. She has incredible energy economy through her frequent counterattacks, and it is difficult for her to overcap on energy due to having 2 ultimate charges. Combined with energy supports like Tingyun, Huohuo, and maybe even Sunday, her ultimate is almost always readily available for use. However, she does suffer some of the same problems as Clara for being a counter DPS, meaning she relies more on RNG for enemies to attack her, and she struggles against slow or non-aggressive enemies. Her signature light cone solves most of her RNG problems, but that does make her less free-to-play friendly. She can also potentially be difficult to play if you can't time her enhanced counters properly, as mistiming it will result in a significant damage loss. Joining her fellow Galaxy Ranger in the S tier is Rappa, our favorite rapping ninja and our most recent addition to the DPS roster. Rappa finds herself at the top of the S tier, and for good reason. Despite being an erudition unit, she has excellent levels of damage across all endgame content. Although she lacks a direct imaginary weakness implant mechanic like Boothill, she makes up for it by spamming weakness ignoring toughness damage. Her kit has built-in weakness break efficiency, super break damage, and passively increases the break damage taken by enemies. However, this alone doesn't earn her this spot in the list. The reason Rappa is so strong is due to her insane potential when paired with a super break support that implants exo toughness on enemies, which may or may not arrive in the form of Qingque. Rappa currently suffers from needing an additional source of super break damage as well as needing consistent breaking to achieve her max potential, which can be solved through exo toughness. Enemies with exo toughness will trigger weakness break when their initial toughness is reduced to 0. Then, their temporary exo toughness can continue to be reduced to 0, in which case weakness break will be triggered again. The only unsolvable problem Rappa faces is that imaginary break is considerably weaker compared to other elements. We have finally reached the S+ tier in this list, which consists of only the cream of the crop DPS characters currently in the game. These characters completely trivialize endgame content, and using these characters is basically like playing the game on easy mode. Starting us off in 3rd place is Acheron, emanator of the Nihility and honestly one of the coldest characters in the game. When she arrived in patch 2.1, she completely redefined the meta due to her unique mechanics and game-breaking damage. Her ultimate is special in that instead of consuming energy, she charges it from stacks gained whenever she uses her skill or when allies apply debuffs on enemies. She boasted unparalleled damage output at the time of her release, which can be attributed to the insane self buffs she gains from her traces. In addition to self buffs, her ultimate also ignores weakness types and 20% all type resistance, making her damage even more devastating. Acheron excels across every game mode as her kit allows her to deal full damage in both single target and AoE content. She has extremely versatile team options as long as the 2 Nihility teammate requirement is satisfied. If you have her E2, which is one of the strongest Eidolons in the game, her team flexibility is further enhanced as she can now slot in a powerful harmony support in place of one of her Nihility teammates. The recent release of Jiaoqiu also contributes to Acheron's dominance in the meta, as he was basically tailor-made for her. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end eventually, and as crazy as it sounds, her age is starting to show ever so slightly. The reason why she has started slipping recently is less about her personal damage, which isn't lacking whatsoever, but because she requires more investment both vertically and horizontally in order to achieve a similar performance with a certain new DPS. Acheron is a character that is extremely dependent on her signature light cone. At E0S0, she is clunky to play and her damage is relatively underwhelming. Many of us have the luxury of E0S1 or even E2S1, so we often overlook this, but the difference between having and not having her light cone is night and day. You also need limited 5-star Nihility supports like Jiaoqiu and Black Swan or Silverwolf in order to compete with the current strongest team, in which Acheron still underperforms at E0 because she lacks access to meta harmony supports like Robin and Ranmei due to her 2 Nihility teammate restriction. Combine everything with the fact that the incredibly powerful break and follow-up attack archetypes won't be going anywhere anytime soon, and a hint towards a potential summoner meta in 3.0 makes Acheron feel like she's slowly being forgotten by Hoyo. Swooping into 2nd place is Firefly, the golden child of Honkai Star Rail. Since her debut in version 2.3, she has received a steady stream of indirect buffs in the form of busted relic and planner sets, break-oriented enemies and endgame content, and extremely synergistic teammates. Firefly is often considered the pioneer of the break meta as she has much higher ownership rates and is much easier to pilot than Boothill, who released a version earlier. She can charge her ultimate extremely fast with her skill's max energy percentage restore and has a natural 25% action advance when using said skill. She transforms into Sam with her ultimate, advancing her action by 100% and gaining vastly increased speed, damage reduction, effect res, and weakness break efficiency when attacking enemies. She has built-in self-sustain and fire weakness implant with her enhanced skill, easily deleting enemy toughness bars and triggering huge weakness breaks. Firefly has an extremely overloaded kit that lends itself to having many ways of improving over time, making her more resistant to power creep. The break set that launched alongside her instantly became the strongest break DPS set in the entire game, and the Kalpagni Lantern Planar set was almost specifically designed for her. The introduction of Apocalyptic Shadow and the past, present, and eternal show boss also demonstrate Hoyo's clear favoritism for this character, as they perfectly play around her strengths. With the introduction of powerful limited 5-star break supports like Lingsha and the upcoming Qingque, as well as powerful free-to-play teammates like Harmony Trailblazer and Gallagher, Firefly is in an incredibly comfy spot in the meta right now, with her title as the Queen of Break being largely uncontested. She also continues the trend of broken E2s, with her E1 and E2 removing skill point consumption from her enhanced skill and granting free turns on top of all of her existing action advance. Her main issues are issues pertaining to the break archetype as a whole, including their inconsistent damage based on enemy weakness, ineffectiveness against enemies that lock their weakness bars, and relatively limited team comps. However, Firefly partially remedies the first issue with her built-in weakness implant, and at the current rate of break units being released, there will soon be enough supports to make more than one break team. We have finally reached first place in the tier list, and it goes to none other than our second general, Fei Xiao. She redefined the meta for crit DPSs just like Acheron did back in version 2.1, and carried the follow-up attack archetype to where it is now, just as what Firefly did for break. She is meta-defining in every sense of the word, and the power and value she delivers is unparalleled. Fei Xiao is an extraordinarily powerful crit-scaling single-target DPS that specializes in ultimate nukes and a relentless barrage of follow-up attacks. She deals constant and consistent follow-up damage and applies numerous self-buffs that are effortless to maintain. She has a unique energy mechanic similar to Acheron, using a stack-based system that accumulates based on ally actions instead of the typical energy values. However, her ultimate also has a generous overcap system that allows her to store up to 2 ultimates at a time, reducing wasted stacks. Her ultimate deals colossal total damage with 2 unique attack types that you can choose from within the ultimate, doing more damage if the target is already weakness broken or if they have yet to be broken. This makes her deal remarkable toughness damage despite not being a break-focused unit. Her upfront power is phenomenal and requires basically no ramp up for her to reach her full potential, effectively making her a stronger version of Dr. Ratio. Her team comps are also incredibly flexible, and she has many excellent free-to-play options as compared to Acheron, including Moza and Hunt March 7th, which you can get E6 for free. Being a crit-scaling follow-up attack DPS, she can capitalize on meta supports like Robin, Topaz, and Aventurine, which just so happens to be her strongest team, as well as arguably the strongest team currently in the game. Just like Acheron and Firefly, she has one of the most game-breaking E2s in the game, allowing her to stack her ultimate much faster. Despite being a hunt character, the amount of follow-up attacks she launches, as well as her synergy with fast-acting teammates, makes her perform surprisingly well in AoE content. She still can't compete with the top meta erudition DPSs that specialize in pure fiction, but she can still easily obtain 3 stars as a hunt DPS, which says something. I guess my only real critique is that she needs Robin in order to achieve max damage, but even that isn't much of a critique, since Firefly needs Ran Mei and Acheron needs Jiao Qiu. And there you have it, my comprehensive tier list of every DPS character in Honkai Star Rail ranked from worst to best. Again, I want to emphasize that just because a character is ranked low on some random YouTuber's tier list doesn't mean that they are bad, unless it's a C tier character, in which, yeah, they are kinda bad. Every character has the potential to perform well when properly built and invested into, and just because a character performs worse than another character doesn't mean you shouldn't play them. You should always feel free to play the characters you personally enjoy rather than forcing yourself to spend resources building and playing a character just because they are strong. Let me know in the comments below if you agree with my list or if there's anything you would personally change. If you enjoyed this video, a like and subscribe would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, keep spreading positivity.